Kharkiv again. Chinese soldiers are fighting for Russia. In this Frontline members video, we're asking why and whether Donald Trump's trade war could be pushing Beijing and Moscow closer together. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defense editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is a Frontline members special video looking at China's involvement in the war in Ukraine. Why are we looking at it now? Well, because at least 2 Chinese nationals have been captured by Ukraine's armed forces, paraded in front of the media. And Ukraine's President Zelensky said at least 155 Chinese nationals are known to be fighting for Russia in the occupied Ukrainian territories. He also said that Ukrainian soldiers had encountered a group of 6 Chinese soldiers regularly in battles, and it was from that group of 6 that the 2 who were captured were taken alive. Now, this has caused consternation around the world. Beijing has categorically denied sending its soldiers to fight. Reuters has reported that a group of between 100 and 200 Chinese nationals are serving in Russia's armed forces fighting in Ukraine. But the suggestion is, and this is based on anonymous intelligence officials, Western intelligence officials, is that those fighters between 100 and 200 are volunteers. They were described as mercenaries, but perhaps akin to the international volunteers who have flocked to the Ukrainian side from countries all around the world. Both Ukraine and Russia are accepting volunteers from third countries. Beijing adamant that these are not representatives of China. These are not uniformed Chinese soldiers fighting on Russia's behalf, which is what we've seen from North Korea. North Korea has made that commitment. North Korea has sent uniformed North Korean soldiers, thousands of them, to fight for Russia. But there are 2 groups of Chinese soldiers involved in this conflict, it would seem, because while those 2 that have been captured, the 6 that were regularly fighting the Ukrainians, and indeed that group of between 100 and 200, Zelensky said 155, may be volunteers, there is a separate claim that China has sent military officials to the front line in order to learn lessons, tactical lessons from this conflict. China's armed forces, whilst massive and growing and technologically empowered, have not fought a state-on-state conflict. And the lessons that armies learn from brutal conflicts like Ukraine are invaluable to the way they shape and learn and train and develop. And it's understandable, perhaps from Beijing's point of view, that they would want to try and learn these lessons from that conflict. So the fighters, we understand, at least Beijing is insisting, are not state-sanctioned, but there has been, according to Western officials, state-sanctioned visits to the front line. Up to this point, China has maintained a sort of wary distance from the war in Ukraine. Days before Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you may remember President Xi Jinping and Putin announced a no-limits friendship, and that was seen as a sign, certainly what Putin would have hoped, that he would have had Chinese backing for his invasion. But in fact, once the war started, China was far more cautious. Now, China has continued to provide Russia with dual-use components. Those are things like the chips and the processors, the valuable hard-to-machine, hard-to-engineer components which are used in weaponry, but they're dual use. So they also have legitimate civilian applications as well, and that is why China can legitimately get away with, or there is some grey area, it can supply them legitimately without necessarily explicitly arming Russia. I think there have been 2 reasons why China kept that relative distance. Perhaps the first is that China has one of its fundamental principles of foreign policy laid out in what is called its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Number 1 is the mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, you can argue whether or not China abides that, but why do they proclaim that? And that's fundamentally because they do not want other countries interfering in their own sovereign affairs. And what they see in the war in Ukraine is Russia violently interfering in the sovereign affairs of its neighbour, and so therefore they cannot be seen to condone that. The second reason they've kept their distance, because fundamentally China has wanted to avoid the massive trade sanctions that America the West and Ukraine's allies have slapped on Russia. And the third thing to note is that China has at key times acted as a handbrake on Vladimir Putin, most notably in October 2022, when Vladimir Putin was considering launching a tactical nuclear weapon as his troops were retreating across Ukraine in disarray. There was a frantic flurry of diplomatic activity once the West got wind of these plans, and that included trips to Beijing and indeed to Delhi, but trips to Beijing, and China was implored and indeed agreed to urge Russia to step back from the brink and not to use nuclear weapons, and that diplomacy was successful. Overall, the war between Russia and Ukraine has been both a positive and a negative thing for China. In the ways that it's been positive for China, well, it has weakened Russia, its neighbour. It has made Moscow supplicant to Beijing. We've seen Vladimir Putin effectively going cap in hand to Xi Jinping to try and get resources, to try and get support. It has stretched the West, it's stretched Europe and America. It's exposed fractures among the West, but among European allies and America over how they should handle it. China may also see opportunities in financial opportunities in the reconstruction of Ukraine that will inevitably follow a peace as and when that peace arrives. And that is possibly why they launched a massive cyber attack against most of Ukraine's ministries in that chaotic period at the very beginning of the war, to glean valuable intelligence that might help them get those sorts of lucrative deals further down the line. But it's also been a huge source of concern. Beijing likely concerned by the alliance we've seen forged between North Korea and Russia, as Pyongyang and Moscow signed an agreement, a mutual defense agreement. We've seen North Korea supplying up to 3 million artillery shells a year, 12,000 North Korean soldiers gone to fight in Russia. That will make North Korea perhaps less beholden on China and perhaps diminish Beijing's influence with its immediate neighbour. They may also be concerned, despite those fractures among the West, China also likely concerned about the resolve it has seen from the West and the way that Western nations have rallied to Ukraine's support. And they are certainly watching this conflict very, very closely for lessons, not just that they can learn on the tactical level, but also the strategic and the geopolitical lessons they can learn as well, which most analysts would suggest they want to apply to any future conflict or attempt to seize control of Taiwan, which President Xi Jinping has openly said is one of his goals. China doesn't want to see Russia humiliated. It doesn't want to see the government in Russia sort of totally collapse, because that could plunge Russia into chaos, and it wouldn't want that on its border. China probably wants to see both Russia and Ukraine and its allies chastened and weakened by this conflict, while China remains free to grow stronger. But, and this is the big but, their main reason for sitting out this war was likely economic, that they didn't want those sanctions that were imposed on Russia imposed on them. And that's because they wanted to continue to prosper economically. And what we have seen in the last days and weeks is Donald Trump imposing 145% tariffs on China. China has responded with vast 125% tariffs on American goods as well. The Cold War, some analysts saying, in the new Cold War, no longer theoretical. This is happening. A trade war has started. Donald Trump has started a trade war. And if China is effectively facing tariffs which are on a par with the sorts of sanctions it might have faced if it had joined the war, then there is an argument, there is a concern that an unintended consequence of this trade war will in fact take away the reason China had for not supporting Russia more. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time, and if I can't answer them on the show, I'll get into the comments and answer them there as well. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle and we're heading towards the Russian border.